Here today for the interview is my friend and colleague, Ken Williams. Ken is a nationally recognized trainer, speaker, coach, and consultant in leadership and in school culture. He's been a practitioner for almost 30 years, and he's leveraged the professional learning community's work model in two separate schools. And now, through his company called Unfold the Soul, Ken helps schools join the why and the how of the work by combining heart, humor, and hammer. He is the author and co-author of several books, including 2015 Starting a Movement, 2021 Beyond Conversations About Race, and the soon-to-be-released Ruthless Equity. Absolutely love that title. Ken is also the host of the Unfold the Soul, Bless His Heart leadership podcast, which, listeners, is a fantastic listen as well. So, Ken, it is great to have you on the podcast finally.
Thank you, brother. It's an honor to be here. Honor to work with you.
Yeah, love having you here. Not only are Ken and I friends and colleagues, we are also in the same NFL pools, not fantasy football, but the pick'em pools where you pick the winners. And I have to be honest with you, Ken kicks my ass in that pool every single year. I'm struggling every year, but I'm coming back for more next fall.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely love the title of the new book, Ruthless Equity. So I want to focus on equity as we dig into our conversation today. And clearly, equity is the modern work of our school systems, but it seems that there are many things today that get passed off as equity work. So for now, let's just focus on racial equity, and then we'll expand to all levels of equity. But from your perspective, knowing that difference, what's the difference between the high leverage substantive equity work and maybe the equity work that is just performative and superficial?
Wow. How long do we have?
We got it's a podcast, Ken.
So here are the challenges. One, equity is nothing new. I've had the great honor, lifetime honor and pleasure to sit at the feet of both Rick and Becky DeFore, and God rest their souls, and Dr. Bob Aker. And the PLC process, when done effectively, is an equity initiative. It's been around for 40 years. And so equity isn't new, but I'm happy that it's now on the tip of everyone's tongue. And of course, when new initiatives hit, it's usually a flashpoint, like something that happens that brings the attention to the surface. And, the social justice movement and George Floyd brought equity a lot of attention through a racial context. But I think that's problematic. I think it's problematic because equity is not a race. It's not an initiative based on race. It isn't. When schools engage in equitable practice, all kids win. And effective equitable practice will make bubble to the surface issues around expectations, paradigms, status quo, bias, even racism. It will bubble to the surface. But when we start it and only look through a racial lens, one, you're leaving tons of kids out. And two, it leaves off a very, very misunderstood aspect of equity that's never talked about, and that is creating a sense of belonging and extending dignity. And that's something I address in my book, and it's based on the work of Cobb and Crownapple, who do just amazing work. One of the problems with equity as it is today, and I'm going to sound like your grumpy uncle right now, because I'm that guy. It's like I've been doing it, and now it's being stretched in 100 different directions. It's been politicized. It's been massaged into narratives. But ultimately, the only equity I'm interested in my profession is the kind that moves the student achievement needle forward tomorrow for the kids who walk in tomorrow. I can't solve institutional racism, right? But I can help embed equitable practice on a campus. One of the real problems with the way equity is being handled today is that it's done through a lens of negativity. Now, I don't say that from a Pollyanna standpoint. What I'm saying is, for example, if you were my life coach, my personal development coach, and we got together in January and you said, all right, Ken, what are your goals for 2022? And I say, all right, I don't want to get fat. I don't want bronchitis. I don't want to be short of breath when I climb 2 flights of steps. I don't want a muffin top hanging over my belt. I don't want gout because I had it in my left foot, but now it's going to be in my right foot and I can't get my shoe on. And at some point you're going to say, okay, wait, Ken, I got what you don't want. What do you want? In other words, when you accomplish those things, what will that bring you? You see, equity work today is void of aspiration, all we talk about, and that's why there's this recent backlash. If you haven't noticed, there's a ton of backlash. I got a friend in Wisconsin. He's got to scrub the words equity, diversity, and inclusion out of all of their policies. People are pissed and they're fighting back because our approach has been, hey, teachers, you're racist, you have bias, you do microaggressions and all the other stuff. And I'm not denying the existence of it, but when you address things with people and it's not in context, folks are going to get defensive. And when you keep hammering them with things that are just negative, 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 no aspiration, it is going to die a fiery death. And that's what's starting to happen right now. All you hear about equity is inequity, anti-racism, anti-bias, microaggressions. None of that is aspirational. None of that portends a bright future, the ideal future. None of it is what we want. It's what we don't want. And I'm telling you, I know, I'm joking around with that personal coach parallel, but it is absolutely true. You're not a good life coach if you help me set goals around not getting fat and not being short of breath. The fact is, if we focus on the aspirational parts of equity, then all of the anti stuff will bubble to the surface eventually. In the PLC process, we talk about a learning for all culture. And then we break it down, because I knock the ambiguity out of everything. I break it down into behavioral, measurable, observable practices. And then once you're executing those practices and we find that there's a pattern of kids from that side of town who aren't learning, then we can talk about bias, but it's being talked about through fertile ground. When we take issues in isolation like we're doing right now and just say, you have bias, you're putting people on the defensive, there's no context, and we set ourselves up for what's happening right now, which is this backlash where people just like, the hell with it, the hell with this equity, let's just get back to instruction. And who's left in its wake? The kids who can least afford it. And I'm talking about all kids. So, that's my perspective on equity is, one, what do we aspire to become? Two, let's stay rooted in instructional practice. I can't solve the pollution problem in the world, but I was chewing a stick of gum 30 minutes ago and a little wrapper. I'm going to make sure I throw it in the trash and not on the ground. So I'm going to do my part. I'm going to start helping world pollution at my home. I'm going to take the garbage out on Wednesday nights and not skip a week because we know what happens. And that's what I help schools focus on, is the stuff that's on your porch,
right,
on your doorstep, in your kitchen.
Is it maybe, Ken, that we are, and not that it's a binary choice, but is it that we are too focused maybe on the macro and trying to solve the big picture, institutional racism, institutional equity issues, and not focused enough on the micro? Would that be a fair way to characterize your stance that you're talking about?
100%. So in addition to things I do, I also put out these, I guess I call them micro learning videos. They're all between 30 seconds and 2 minutes long. Yeah. And I did one recently on some word I made up called selequity, selective equity. And that's when schools and districts find themselves looking out the window at these grand macro issues. You say macro in my book, I say, don't go global, go granular. Go granular and take care of the stuff on your porch right there. We have plenty of opportunity. We don't need to make up any new words right now. We don't need any new terms. There are enough we had existing equity problems before COVID and the social justice movement. I'm not working on new stuff. I'm just working on it in the context of a pandemic, right? Or endemic, or wherever we are right now. But yes, we focus on macro. I describe Selequity in that way, where we get to have intense discussions, woke intensity. We get to, sweat at the brow. And in the end, nothing happens because all we've done is shout out problems. What I'm going to do is, one of the questions I posed is, for all these places doing the book studies on anti-racism, that's cool. And I'm glad it's good work. But can you be anti-racist and still got kids in below grade level track classes all year long? See, that's the part I have a problem with, because that there, sir, is an equity issue. That is a social justice issue. And that transcends race. I work in plenty of small rural districts where no one looks like me. And there are many parallel expectation issues, right? Inequitable policies in place.
Yeah.
So equity is not a race issue. It may have been brought to the surface through an incident rooted in race, but it is not a racial issue. Equitable practice gets everyone. So let's get granular. That's the thing. We're shouting out the window at these macro issues, at these global issues, and not addressing daily policies and practice that are aligned and misaligned with equity. And that's nothing. Equity's become, so that's another video I did. I talk about taking the helium out of equity. Equity's just kind of float up into the cloud as this amorphous thing. And I keep pulling a damn balloon back to earth and saying, no, this is what equity is. So I have my own definition of equity. You know, I outline it in the book. It's concrete, measurable, and applicable.
Is this maybe, you know, as I'm thinking about, you know, the controversies that have certainly bubbled to the surface with critical race theory, and is that which has its own narrative? I mean, obviously CRT is a legal framework that is meant to examine institutional racism, and so many people have trouble distinguishing between the idea of racism versus being a racist, that you can have institutional racism without individuals being racist. That's a hard thing for people to distinguish between. But the idea of putting people on the defensive and the narrative's kind of been hijacked. Do you think that, you know, you talked about being more micro than macro and shouting out problems versus solutions or aspirational? Is that what's gone wrong, in your opinion, with critical race theory, and why that's now been weaponized by some to mean something it is not?
Well, so I'm going to answer this question carefully.
Yeah.
From a global framework, yes, because to me that falls under we're looking out the window at these grand issues and ignoring what's going on our campus today, things we can affect today. Yeah. So I mean, from a global issue. Now, I'll be honest with you, you know, extra time is an oxymoron. And I tell schools all the time, your schedule reflects your priorities. And so I'm not afraid to tell you that I've not done a deep dive into critical race theory or the 1619 project. And so I can't speak to them because I've chosen to spend all my time looking at things we can impact tomorrow. Like I'm not going to, the plates are already full. I don't need to add anything else yet. I got ability groups rampant all over the place. We've got student tracking. We've got, you know, a focus on teaching versus learning everywhere. We've got this, you know, disproportionate percentage of kids being, you know, suspended. And we have a complete lack of sense of belonging. I mean, violating dignity is such a norm in our schools. And in the book, I outline this practice that costs nothing, that researchers found results in a 20% increase in academic engagement, a 9% decrease in disruptive behaviors, and a potential additional hour of academic time without adding anything. And you know what that is? Positive greetings at the door.
The door. I had a feeling you were going there.
Students at the door. And I'm looking at things like that because, again, belongingness and inclusion. And I don't mean inclusion in the special education sense.
Yeah.
I mean, walking into a room and not feeling compelled to change something about yourself, and walking into a room and knowing that you belong there, which must be intentional, right? That transcends race. And that's the part we jump to race too soon.
Okay.
Because in my opinion, race gets us looking at why we're different first, when belonging transcends that. I've walked into rooms full of people who look like me and all my cousins and have felt out of place. I've walked into rooms where all the people look like me and my cousins, and I felt at home. I bowl a lot. I started bowling last fall and I'm consumed with it. And somehow or another, I subbed for a guy one night and he invited me to this league on Tuesday mornings where if I can't make it, I don't have to find a sub. So it works out with my travel. It's a bunch of retired Delta employees. On one end, looks like guys who grew up in the country, like chewing on tumbleweed, to guys who seem like cosmopolitan and sophisticated, and everywhere in between. I'm the only bowler of color there. And I haven't put my finger on what these guys have done, but from day one, I've been folded in as one of the guys. And I feel like I belong. And those guys are my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have political discussions or racial discussions, none of that. There's just a sense of belonging there that they opened up their organization and brought me in. I didn't have to come in and change anything about myself. That's a powerful sense of belonging that transcends race. So then if we do get into discussions about race, we start with what makes us alike, what makes us the same. We never start that way. We always start with what makes us different. And it's human nature to figure out which of our differences makes us superior to the other. And so I start equity work in an almost spiritual sense with the sense of belonging. I mean, every human being has that yearning. We want to belong. We want to be seen. We want to be valued. That transcends race. And then we get into what does equitable practice look like? How is equity defined? How is it defined? You go on social media and it's defined 50 different ways, depending on someone's narrative. All I care about is equitable practice that moves the needle tomorrow.
Yeah. It seems that, you mentioned social media, the news, it seems like that the sport of the day now is to dunk on people on social media and to attack them for every little word. And I think your message, Ken, is very powerful in the sense that we focus on what we can control. And that sense of belonging transcends everything that we do. So let's talk about what we can control. And that is, equity within the school system and within the school setting. And sometimes I notice, and maybe this is not a fair observation, you could tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, but sometimes I notice that equity gets talked about in absence of academic achievement, that real equity is about academic success and belonging in an academic environment, and all learners can reach high levels of academic performance. So, sometimes schools forget that part of the equity work. Do you subscribe to that? Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that happens? And how important is it for us to keep ourselves focused on the prize, if you will?
My book isn't out yet, but I feel like you've read it because I talk about this very issue.
All right.
And one of the examples I use is, I drive a couple of vintage cars and I've got a mechanic with an old school cat there who works on old GMs. And I love this place. I mean, it's Litz Automotive. And my point is this. If Mike, who owns Litz Automotive, decides to take his technicians through a couple of modules around equity work, I'm going to be 100% sure that somehow, some way, those modules are going to help them execute their fundamental purpose even better, which is to keep cars drivable. That's their fundamental purpose. If I don't know why they would engage in equity practice, but if they did, I'm sure Mike would draw a line between the equity modules to their fundamental purpose, keeping cars drivable, repairing automobiles. That's their fundamental purpose. I don't expect that they'll do that. I expect they have ones on, the fuel injection and brake systems because it feeds their fundamental purpose. So it drives me absolutely out of my mind when we come up with ways to put instruction and learning aside and address other things. It's what Rick used to tell us based on Jim Collins' work. Jim Collins called it a sucker's choice, right? The falling prey to the tyranny of or and not the genius of and. Learning is the through line of our work. That's what we do. We ensure learning. And so there's no way to separate the two. If we engage in equity work, it is in the service of high levels of learning for all students, providing equity, excellence, and achievement for all students, regardless of background. The same thing happened when we were coming. It seemed like, more schools were going, we were coming out that summer. I guess it was 19 or 20. And all I saw were tons of teachers. I'm going to focus on SEL and I'm going to hug kids and I know they're going to be traumatized and I'm not going to engage in learning for like 3 weeks. And we were just like, these are like a basketball. Why? One, you are casting brokenness on kids. And if you want to talk about patterns and equity, 90% of the time it's going to be the kids who can least afford it.
Right.
Two, and Doug Reeves, one of my colleagues and friends, wrote a great blog post called Don't Take the L Out of SEL, because we weren't doing SEL, we were doing SE. We're going to remove the learning. Everything we do is in the service of moving learning forward. Building relationships is about moving learning forward because people prefer to learn from people they like, who like them, and who see them. Everything we do. And so I don't deny that some students came back and dealt with trauma and adversity and this, this rug being pulled out from under them again. But what I'm asking teachers to do is to base their response on evidence, right?
Mhm.
In my book, I talk about teachers do three things. Great teachers. They assume nothing, they prepare for everything, and they respond based on evidence. Be ready if you have students who seem to have trouble adjusting. But when they come in and we've already cast them as broken and traumatized, we're setting ourselves up because a lot of the time they're going to take our cues and then, show those things. And then we're not basing things on evidence. It's got to be based on, we should never push learning aside. There's no instance where learning should be pushed aside. Ruthless equity focuses on practices and policies that advance equity in learning, and then those that impede equity in learning. If you engage to find out whether or not kids are dealing with trauma and adversity, it should be as a result of you engaging them in the learning process. And then you see there's something going on, then we stop and try to address that thing.
Yeah.
But to assume that it's happening on the front end, I think is part of what equity is trying to solve, just
Right. It's interesting as you were talking there, I sort of had a flashback or a thought about one of my many epiphanies throughout my career. And that is, I had a moment, midway through my career where I started to realize how much I was projecting onto students things I was assuming. And when you talked about the assumptions we make about students, I was assuming a lack of resiliency. I was assuming some fragility. I was assuming that the student couldn't handle it. And I was becoming guilty of almost projecting onto the students some low expectations in isolated places. And I had this moment, I wouldn't say halfway, it was probably earlier than that, but partway through my career where I started to realize, wait a minute, it's not up to me to project onto the student. My job is to teach them and support them and help them and give them feedback and help them go all that way. Why do you think we do that? Why do you think I mean, it probably comes from the right place. It comes but how do we, I suppose, why do we do that? And secondly, how do we prevent ourselves from falling into that trap? What are some things we might be able to do to help ourselves remember not to project onto students?
I think it's part of human nature to make assumptions and judge. I did the same thing. It didn't last for long. At the beginning of the pandemic, lots of schools went to online learning and virtual learning, and a friend and colleague, Jessica Cabine, reached out to me and said, I know we're at the beginning of this pandemic, but I want my folks to be ready when we come out the other side. So it was like, if the pandemic dropped in March, like the end of March, she was like, I want you to do 6 modules with my middle school teams. And so we set them up. We're going to talk about the PLC process. And I fell into my own trap, the first module. I'm on there and I projected brokenness on those teachers. Mm-hmm. And I did a damn therapy session for 40 of the 50 minutes. And at the 45-minute mark, someone said, "Let's talk about PLCs." That's when I realized, holy shit. I'm telling you, that woke me up to it. I was like, oh my God. Because I just assumed that they're going through who's been through this pandemic before? And there was no playbook. But if you hover above it, the principles are the same, whether I thought these teachers are from a bad neighborhood or like we do with kids, from that side of town. I just projected and screwed it up. I apologized. I fell on my own sword. And every other module after that was awesome. Ironically, I think it was module 3. I was working with a team and there was a teacher, you could just tell on the screen, like there was something going on with her. And she was struggling with like missing her kids and having that connection. And so she was dealing with some real local trauma. And we stopped and put arms around and took a few minutes to kind of talk her through. Like, that's the way it should happen. I tried to engage them in learning. I got the sense that there's something going on with this teacher. And the space was safe enough for her to come forward with what was troubling her. And that was the appropriate way to approach it. One other thing I'll mention is when we fall into that trap consistently and it becomes a pattern, and you see it all the time, and a lot of my videos talk about it, it's the fine line between what I call charity and advocacy work. Charity and advocacy. See, charity, you pity the students, and we feel sorry for them, and we want to bubble wrap them and keep them safe and avoid trouble and trauma and stuff. They've been through so much. And the challenge of it is it's couched in love. It has the same horrible effects as prejudice and racism do, but they come from two different ends, but they meet in the middle. I call them two sides of the same coin, because that charity work is going to do nothing but inspire learned helplessness, entitlement, mooch in the system, laziness, lack of self-esteem. Advocacy work, and all of this I frame with, when you have a student who's performing below grade level, could be significantly behind. The difference is when you meet that student where he is and both eyes are fixed on the student, the best you're hoping for is that he just grows some. I just want to be better than he was at the beginning of the year. That's charity work. That's when you think you're doing the kids a favor by coming into that badass neighborhood and teaching these kids, or this poor neighborhood, or whatever it is. Advocacy work is when you got one eye on the kid and you got one eye fixed on where they have to go, grade level or better. Because when you got one eye on the kid and one eye on grade level or better, that's going to pace your instruction. It's going to pace your intervention. It's going to help you figure out what to be ruthless about and cut away, what to be ruthless about and include. It's going to help you identify learning outcomes that will give you bang for the buck, that will buy you leverage. Because learning isn't linear. We want it to be linear. That kid's 2 years behind. Let's say it's 100 targets a year. That means the kid's 200 targets behind. Traditionally, we think of there's no way to make that up in 1 year, so we pobrecito the kid. And we do charity work and hope they grow. But when I've surveyed tens of thousands of educators and asked them, not one educator has ever wanted that for their kids. They don't want that for their kids. They want you to say, okay, that kid's behind. That's where they need to go. What's the most efficient route? Brian Butler, a colleague and friend of ours, they did that masterfully at their school. They would start the year when kids were behind. Let's develop a plan to grow this kid 1.5 years in a year's time. And it wasn't a wish or a t-shirt or a lanyard. Like, they had a plan. Did it work every time? No. But did they move more kids further and faster into higher levels than they would have just hoping they grow some? Absolutely.
Right. So your talk about charity reminds me of that expression, the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes.
And nowhere I think you could see that. And you're right about the danger of that, is that it is couched in love. It is the blanket of love. And you can't, on the one hand, blame people for feeling, compassionate for their students and what they've been through, but helping them overcome and helping them push through and helping them catch up is really the goal. Listeners, you'll recall we had Brian on the podcast in November, Ken, and just a great interview. So go ahead. The expectations that we have.
When you're doing charity work, it sparks sympathy, and sympathy ignites pity. And then we just hope they grow some. When you're doing advocacy work, that kid being behind sparks urgency. And then that sparks a plan. Like, I got 45 minutes. I could talk, I could teach this kid for 3 hours, but I got 45 minutes. So what are the most high leverage outcomes I can focus on? I know it's couched in love, but it's a form of othering. It's almost like you're looking down on people that way, instead of advocacy, which is taking every student to grade level or better. But it's couched in love, and so it gets a pass. It gets a pass a lot, and so there's so much of that in education. I haven't had time to unearth all the new stuff people want to pile on to a pile that's already big enough. And because the way I end the Celequity video is, again, you get the woke discussions, intensity, passion, all of it without having to do any of the work. Isn't that great? Yeah. You have to do the work. You don't have to examine your practice and talk about how you have teachers teamed Or do you provide collaborative planning time? Do they understand the process of teaching, learning, and assessment? Like all those things we'd have to look at, because we just keep shouting out, all the antis, which gets all the attention. And again, the people left in the wake are students who walk into our building tomorrow.
Right. I love that idea of our compassion being directed toward urgency as opposed to pity, and focusing on a plan for how we can help our students raise their level of performance and reach those high levels of intellectual performance. It's interesting because I often say that from an assessment perspective, a different lens maybe at times, although there's a lot of equity to how we assess for sure.
Absolutely.
But the question is either we believe that students can reach high levels of intellectual performance, or we don't. And that's where it starts.
Yeah.
You either believe they can, despite what they're having to overcome. And certainly when you take the extreme situations, and some students have extreme situations, but we can't argue that as the norm. We have to know that that is an extreme situation.
Yeah.
Ken,
And
you are
in my work, I won't even address the do we believe all kids can learn at high levels. What I address is, do we believe we have the goods, that we have the ability to ensure high levels of learning?
Do we have the efficacy?
Do we have it? Do you and your team have it?
Are we good enough?
Kids, kids have demonstrated. Video games don't even come with instructions anymore.
No,
they don't come with instructions. They get on there and they master that stuff. They master technology. All kids, from everywhere.
Yeah,
right. And they get immediate feedback. It's one of the things Doug Reese pointed out in this blog. Those video games provide. The video games don't publicito any kids. Like your ass lost. You lost. You suck. Come back later. And no kid gets off like, I'm traumatized because the video game said I suck. They don't. They take a break. They come back. They log on and they go after it again. Kids need structure. Kids need wins, and wins come from engaging them in the learning. So that's how I couch it. We don't question whether or not kids can learn. That's obvious.
Yeah.
The question is,
for sure,
do you and your team have the goods? Because that's where the breakthrough comes from. Do we believe we have what it takes to ensure high levels of learning for all kids? And if we leverage collaboration the right way, and we use assessment the right way, not to confirm what we already knew before we gave the assessment, but to show us what about our instruction is working, what's not, and then how we're going to get those kids across the finish line, we'll be unstoppable.
Absolutely. Ken, you are certainly known for many things, but one of my favorite Ken Williams isms is start with the crown. I love that expression. And for our listeners, Ken, what do you mean by that? Start with the crown.
Well, just a bit of history. I attended Morehouse College here in Atlanta, Georgia.
There you go.
Because of my 7th grade teacher who sat me down in 7th grade and looked past my hand-me-downs and my Wonder Bread bag posing as a lunchbox, told me about the history of college and said, you're going to college. So my junior year of high school, I sent away for the brochure and it came back. And on the back of the book, there was a quote by a past president, Dr. Howard Thurman. And the quote said, above the head of her students, Morehouse holds a crown she challenged to grow tall enough to wear. I didn't understand the quote fully at the time, but it stuck with me. And all these years later, I realized that's what equity is. That's instructional equity. And so when you as a teacher identify an essential outcome, a learning outcome that every student must master, every student, to be successful at the next grade level, the next course, the high stakes assessment in life beyond the K-12 system. I used to see that all the time. If 8th grade teachers decide, based on their conversations with 9th grade and how we want to turn students out after high school, that every 8th grader has got to walk out knowing how to make this remote with its 6, 7, carry to 1, 8 buttons, then the question of can they or can't they goes out the window because we've deemed it essential, right? And that means this is the crown. We hold this crown still, and no matter who the kid is, where they're from, what they look like, who the mama is, whether daddy's at home at night, or what the income is, our work is to grow the kids to the crown. To the crown. That makes equity tangible. Equity must have an essential learning outcome. Must. Even the pictures of the equality versus equity images, and I include them in the book that we find on the web, they all have an essential outcome. The most popular one is having those kids see the game with an unobstructed view. That's the essential outcome. And so we have to provide students what they need when they need it with urgency to master essential outcomes. So real equity is about starting with the crown and not the kid. I'm not watching the kids walk in and trying to figure out Tom Schimmer's background and what his life is. All that stuff is context. What I first need to figure out is what are Tom's strengths and what is he great at. You need to take an enrichment approach to it, mine for his strengths, and then use those strengths to strengthen underdeveloped areas. Now, this is the crown in 8th grade, but there are going to be some kids that aspire to this one. This one's got like 32 buttons on it. This one, some kids are going to get, some aren't. Above the crown, kids will separate themselves, but we got to stop creating more and more low groups below the crown. I got a video coming out soon that basically says schools are putting too much pressure on Marvel Comics and Marvel Universe because we running out of superheroes to name low groups after because we keep creating low groups. If we start with the crown, right, and not the kid, then you're going to know intellectually that traditional tracking and ability groups cannot exist, which means ability groups cannot exist in a culture of equity. Cannot. We got to be going after great level of better with every kid. And the beauty of the crown is that it takes the pressure off teachers. They don't have to judge. I don't have to figure out what you know and what you don't know. There's no question of whether Tom can or can't. We've said he must. And so we must marshal resources and supports to grow him to the crown. Right now in schools, we got crowns. We got a crown for these kids and a crown for those kids. A crown for the kids on this side of town, a crown for the kids on that side of town. We got a crown for poor white kids, poor black kids, poor brown kids. We got a crown for kids who don't speak the King's English. We got a crown for kids with IEPs, but there's just one crown. In life, there's just one crown. And if we take that approach and then only deal with the one question equity answers, which is how will we get them there? It's going to take care of a lot of our issues. And if we do have issues that bubble up, we see patterns of certain kids not making it, at least it's growing from fertile soil and not from reactionary, politicized narratives. And when I say politicized, I mean on both sides. And I don't belong to either side, by the way.
Yeah,
I'm of the pragmatic party. I just want to do what makes sense, and I don't care who says it.
Right. But that is exactly how we focus on the micro and focus on what is within our control. So as we finish up here, Ken, I want to talk a little bit about leaders. I know you work with leaders a lot, and your podcast is for leaders and for leaders. Well, it's for everybody, but you certainly focus on your role as a leader in the past. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what is some advice you have for school leaders, maybe district leaders, about how they can create an authentic culture of equity in their schools? What are some important habits? I mean, we've talked a little bit about them, but important habits, mindsets, routines, some granular things leaders can do to create that kind of real equity in their schools.
Okay, so one is the understanding of like cascading leadership. And that's something that Tom Manning and his authors talked about in, I believe it was Amplifying Leadership. I may be calling the book wrong, but the principal is teachers are like the principals of the kids. And then the principal, their classroom, the teachers. And then at the district level, I always ask, who's the principal of the principals, right? And so we got to make sure that each of those leadership levels set their people up to be successful. We can't ask for equity. We can't ask for learning for all if teachers and leaders and students are not put in position through structures, policies, and practices that allow them to flourish and be their best. So for principals, it's understanding how to leverage collaborative teams, how to monitor the process without having to be at every meeting supervising and making sure the word gets done. You see what I did with that? I said supervise, but then I slid the N in there. It's also with principals understanding how buy-in works and doesn't work. And we're not going to go into it here, but there's a lot of misinformation about how buy-in works. And knowing that there's one thing principals can do that no one else can do. Principals are the linchpin of equity and every other initiative. Because the one thing principals can do that no one else can do, not even the superintendent, is make things happen school-wide. Make things happen school-wide. And part of principalship is being visionary. You have to see around corners for your people. When I take teams through the teaching, learning, and assessment cycle, and I immerse them in this experience where they come out the other side and they perform and they've executed like a high-performing PLC team without even knowing it. I asked them, just imagine every team operating the way you did in those 7 minutes. What do you think the results will be? They're like, my God, it'll be great. That's awesome. But not every person's going to see that on the front end. You can't wait for everybody to just go, oh my God, now I understand it. You got to see around corners for people. The job of the principal is to hunt, gather, protect, and defend. Is to make a case for change, hunt and gather the resources and supports for teachers to make that change. And then we got to take them by the hand and walk them all into the shallow end of the water. The worst thing in the world is when you got a school where some teams are opting in and some teams are opting out. That's the worst. And that's a leadership issue because that rests with the principal. And then for district leaders, what I would say is we finally turned the corner on teacher isolation. We're not where we need to be yet, but we've turned the corner now where collaboration is a norm. But man, principal isolation is it's the unmentionable boogeyman that still exists. Yeah. And district leaders need to treat their principals like collaborative teams. We know fourth grade teachers get better when they collaborate effectively around the right questions with other fourth grade teachers. Well, principals get better when they collaborate around the right questions with other principals. And too often they're left to their own devices, their own fiefdoms, and all they've got is what's up here. And we don't place them in structures where they operate collaboratively, openly, transparently. Principals I coach, I got a group. They're moving through the process so powerfully because when teachers talk about the challenges of collaboration, they're like, you know what? We're having the same issues in our principal collaboration PLC team. Like they're walking the walk. And that's powerful for principals because a lot of them haven't been through this process and have challenges asking teachers to do what wasn't expected of them. That wasn't brief, but that's what I
got. Well, I think you mentioned recently on one of your podcasts about how important it is for principals to have a network, a support network, and be able to talk to others within your district or somewhere to be able to coach them up. Great advice, Ken. Certainly, important to stay connected and to have that sounding board as opposed to just not being in isolation, making sure that we have that connection to other people. 2 questions as we finish up here, Ken, and these are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. The first question, and you can take this in any direction you want to, but the question is, educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
Oh boy. What keeps me up at night is what I perceive to be the crisis of confidence that we have as educators. That we've made Carol Dweck a millionaire several times over, and deservedly so, for her great work mindset. And we bought more growth mindset posters and got them around our schools everywhere. And yet we still revert back to the fixed mindset notions of the innate ability paradigm. And some kids are born smart and some aren't, and ability grouping and tracking and saving the best and most innovative instruction for the 15% of our population we term as quote unquote gifted. The fact that when assessment data comes back, research has shown that as teachers, we attribute 85% of assessment results to issues of character and things that are going on outside of control, and only 15% of it do we own. That keeps me up because teachers are the difference. Principals, educators are the difference. When I say educator, I mean every person in that building who touches the life of a child, including our nutrition staff, custodians, paraprofessionals, support professionals. And so my life's work is pouring into educators and coaching them up to understand that the answers are in the room. Yeah. The answers are not in the community. That's context. The answers are in the room. And when we lean into our collective expertise and put our backs to the wall and decide on learning for all, we're unstoppable.
Yeah, it's definitely you're definitely right about reverting back to those habits and those that have been ingrained in so much of what we do in our system. All right, last question is a question about success, personal success. You take this again wherever direction you want to go to, but it's a simple question, and that question is: if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, "What's your definition of success?" how would you answer them?
Oh boy. I would say putting yourself in position to stretch beyond your reach and take swings in the service of what you believe your life purpose is. And those things can change over time. Just putting yourself in position to take swings at achieving your life's purpose.
Yeah, take a swing at achieving your life's purpose.
Yes.
I love that. That's a great way of putting it. Listeners, there are just a tremendous number of ways you can connect with Ken. Twitter and Instagram, the handle is at Unfold the Soul. And Facebook, Unfold the Soul. LinkedIn, Unfold the Soul. You see a pattern here. YouTube, Unfold the Soul. The website, www.unfoldthesoul.com. And of course, I've mentioned the podcast. And Ken, I didn't really do it right when I introduced the podcast because you do a bit of a voice inflection with the bless his heart. Can you talk a little bit about the podcast and maybe why you do the Unfold the Soul, bless his heart leadership podcast?
I can. So
Yeah.
I'll just add that to the screen if people want to scan that code. That's another way to get to all that I offer. But
Sure.
the impetus for, I was working in a district that had all sorts of strata, but on the whole, pretty high performing and pretty progressive, well-funded Montgomery County Public Schools just outside of Washington, D.C. Problem was, my wife and I, both educators, couldn't afford a modest single-family home with a patch of grass in that district. And it bothered me that I had to leave the district to go buy a house. Like, we're the profession that creates all professions. So I had fondness for Atlanta. The price of bread might be the same, but Atlanta builds a house for everybody. You can get your come up in Atlanta. So I called my friends and said, I'm moving back to Atlanta. I'm be a principal. Where should I apply? They were like, any place but Clayton County. And I was like, okay, good. I'm not applying to Clayton County. Well, something happens when you resign a position, apply for a new one, and don't get a call for weeks.
Right.
You apply to Clayton County, and I'm glad I did. I got the job. I left my family behind for 3 weeks. I got to the first pre-planning day for principals, assistant principals, and district personnel. I inherited the lowest performing school in the district, and at the time, Clayton County was the lowest performing school district in the greater Atlanta area. I walked in, introduced myself, and people are so friendly, such Southern hospitality. And I say, my name is Ken. Were you principal? I say, Swin. They say, oh, bless your heart. And I say, thank you so much. Because I didn't know what it meant. But then I picked up on a pattern. Like, every third person said, bless your heart. And then an older Black woman, could have been my mother. I swear, when I introduced myself to her, I think she laid hands on me and said, bless your heart. And that's when I knew that I had inherited the Hot Mess Express. And so on top of that, when I left Maryland, one of my treasured mentors, Ellie DeYoung, gifted me with 2 big fat blank journals and challenged me to journal my journey. I hate writing, but she's such an influence on my life, I couldn't let her down. And so I journaled every day of my years there. And I don't know, 14 years later, I decided to turn it into a weekly podcast where I read the entries verbatim, uncut and uncensored, talk about how I screwed things up or occasionally got things right, and leave leaders with reflections. A podcast, the longest is about 15 minutes. And so that's the root of the Bless His Heart Leadership Podcast.
Fantastic. Listeners, honestly, it's a great listen, inspirational, honest, authentic. There's just a tremendous amount to learn from Ken, for sure, in all the different ways that you can connect with Ken. Ken, I really appreciate you being here today. Thanks for doing this, man.
Thank
I
you,
appreciate
brother.
it.